Hello everyone, my name is Mandeep Singh and I'm a Senior Technical Support Officer at the Transport Research Center at UTS Tech Lab, Botany. The title of my presentation today is The Factors Affecting Mud Pumping of Subgrade Fines Under Ballasted Railway Tracks. To start with, the outline of my presentation is as follows. I will start up with the brief introduction, followed by the soil properties influencing mud pumping, the external factors that affect mud pumping, followed by a brief summary and the acknowledgement. What is mud pumping? It is defined as the upward movement of moisture to form a soil slurry along the railway tracks under the action of moving railway loads. As you can see from the figure on the left, it shows the severity of mud pumping on a track along the southeastern coast of New South Wales. We can see that the subgrade soil has formed a slurry along the railway tracks and severely impacted the performance of the railway. This usually occurs along the shallower regions of the subgrade, and there are as many as 300 active locations of mud pumping along the eastern coast of New South Wales. You can see from the figure on the right, there is an existence or a formation of a purged water table on the top of the subgrade, and it keeps the soil fully saturated, and it causes damage to the sleepers as well and forms a mini soil volcano along the sides of the railway track. Coming to the important soil properties that influence the mud pumping or the pumping of fine particles. Firstly, the soil plasticity. You can see from the figure on the top right that soils having a plasticity index between 5 and 30 are more vulnerable to mud pumping. Highly cohesive soils, on the other hand, due to the higher intermolecular attraction forces of these soils, tend not to fluidize under railway tracks. The other important aspect that influences mud pumping is the minimum fluidization velocity. It is defined as the minimum seepage velocity at which same grain particles begin to flow. This seepage velocity is a function of the area as well as the effective weight of the soil grain. Continuing on the soil properties, the other important aspect is the in-situ water content. As I have mentioned it earlier, the coastal floodplains of eastern New South Wales keep the subgrade soil saturated for most parts of the year. Under the action of moving loads, the natural water content reaches the liquid limit of the soil, and this facilitates in an easier or a quicker pumping of fines under the action of railway loads. Another important aspect is the relative compaction. It is defined as the ratio of a compacted density of the specimen to that of the maximum dry density of the soil as obtained from standard proctor. What I have observed from my research is that specimens which are compacted at a higher relative compaction require higher cyclic stresses to fluidize. I will be discussing on the aspect of high cyclic stresses in the upcoming slides. Another important aspect is the fines content. With the inclusion of plastic fines, what we have observed is by increasing the plastic fines or the cohesive fines content from 0 to 10%, it has led to an increase in the cyclic resistance of the soil. On the other hand, when the plastic fines increases dramatically from 10 to 30%, there has been a slow reduction. External factors that lead to mud pumping in the ballasted rail tracks will be discussed now. As I mentioned earlier, the cyclic stress ratio, this plays a very important role in the fluidization or the pumping of fines. It is directly related to the axle loads as well as the speeds of the train. Higher axle loads generate higher dynamic stresses, which result in higher cyclic stresses being subjected onto the shallower subgrade regions. To define the cyclic stress ratio, where we can see it is the ratio of the dynamic stress onto the soil divided by twice the effective confining stress. On the figure on the left, we can clearly see that when the CSR exceeds 0.5, there is a sudden increment in the cyclic axial strains as well as the mean excess for water pressure ratio. When this happens, the specimen is subjected to fluidization. Additionally, I have investigated the liquidity index of the specimen. So I have divided the specimen into 4 parts and measured the water contents at all the 4 layers and defined the liquidity index as the ratio of the water content to the liquid limit to that of the plasticity index. At the top of the specimen, what I have observed is that the liquidity index ratio is close to 1, implying that within the specimen there was a redistribution of water content which led to the formation of slurry at the top of the specimen under the action of cyclic loads. Another important external factor is the impeded drainage due to the fouling of ballast. When subgrade pumping occurs, the clay particles or the fine particles clog the ballast and foul the ballast, which results in the degradation of the hydraulic conductivity of the ballast. As we can see from the figure on the right, as and when the contamination of the ballast is increased from 0 to 80%, there is a dramatic reduction in the hydraulic conductivity of the fouled ballast. This not only results in reduced drainage capacity, but also promotes higher generation of cyclic excess flow pressure due to the undrained condition due to the hindrance of the free drainage capacity of the ballast. Another important aspect is the zones of localized stress concentration. These may be due to the rail defects or wheel joints or transition zones. These localized stress concentration impart higher stresses on the ballast and thereby impart higher stresses on the subgrade, which amplifies the stresses that come onto the subgrade layer, which causes mud pumping. In summary, I would like to conclude that mud pumping is basically governed by two important factors. One is the external factors which are dependent on the train or the loading of the heavy axle generated by the heavy haul cranes. This can be quantified in terms of the cyclic stress ratio as well as the frequency. The fouled ballast, which reduces the drainage of the free draining capacity of the ballast, the stress concentration zone, and the soil parameters. Soil parameters such as soil plasticity, the in situ water content, the initial void ratio, which is dependent on the relative compaction. The presence of cohesive or non-cohesive fines is another important aspect, and more importantly, the minimum fluidization velocity, which causes the formation of slurry and thereby subgrade mud pumping. I would like to acknowledge the Transport Research Center at UTS, the CEE team at Tech Lab Botany, ARC for funding this research, ITTC-Rail, the industry partners such as ACRI, MTM, Transport for New South Wales, Sydney Trains, etc., and my friends and family for their constant support. Thank you. These are my references. If you have any questions, I'll more than happy to answer them. Thank you.